2. The Lake Chamber. I fell for longer than I had expected, the humid and stifling air of the underworld buffeting around my ears as I plummeted. But I soon left the chute free of injury from the walls, and for a few long seconds I felt as if I were in the open sky, as sound and space seemed to radiate out around me, and left me with the impression I was in a massive chamber. Then I hit the water, feet first, and despite the shock of entry, the landing was clean, and I found my legs were still in working order as I flailed blindly around for the bundled jacket, which I'd lost my grip on in the moment before impact. The water was shockingly warm, as so much of the underworld has proven to be, but almost nude, I didn't have any clothing to encumber me, and found that my impact was the sole source of ripples along the surface. The pool was remarkably still, but the noises I made carried far and wide, and left me with the impression that I was in a vast body of water. My cautious kicking to stay afloat brushed no stone or obstacles, and I sensed somewhere deep in me that I was far from the bottom. One of my tentative sweeps with my hand over the nearby surface found the bundled jacket bobbing in the water, and I clutched it against one side of me, my last lonely pieces of the world far above. I looked around, and at first took myself to be in total darkness. I looked up and thought I might be glimpsing the faint glimmer of the prison's distant candlelight through the chute I'd jumped down. But then, faint as could be, I realized there was more than one glimmer of light on the ceiling up there, far overhead. There were hundreds of them, spaced across a chamber that must have been more than a mile across. If you've found this account, it's likely you've seen such buried grandeur yourself down here. I would come to learn such things are far more regular than I'd ever dreamed. It took me some moments to adjust my eyes and attain enough calm to really drink in the details of my surroundings, but I soon realized these spots along the cavern's roof moved, shimmering and shifting faintly overhead. It took me yet more nervous moments treading water in the great pool to see their source, and recognize that they were coming up from beneath me. I had not bothered, as yet, to look downward. Partly this was because I had no expectation I would see anything, but this lack of perception had as much to do with the fact that I didn't want to know what was beneath me, as it did with my anticipation of total darkness. But now I had to look, and what I found was not total darkness. Far below were the faint and wavering outlines of glinting clusters along the lake bottom. And indeed, it must have been a deep subterranean lake, for the gleaming lights on its floor were so far away they looked more like stars than defined shapes. They were vivid and saturated, ranging from blue to pink to yellow, their brightness often wavering from moment to moment. My later experiences would tell me these were almost certainly fungal blooms or some other such luminescent growth, but in the moment, the warbling of the water and the strain of my eyes in the gloom gave them the illusion of movement, and I believed they must be fish or other beasts flitting around down there in the dark. I stared entranced for a short while, but before long, actual movement drew my eyes, this time of a black shape against those distant lake-bottom stars that blotted some of them out as it swam fluidly around in the depths. A shape was all it was to me from so far away. And yet, I knew looking at it, given the distance, the swimmer in the deeps below must be massive indeed. I had never seen a whale or a shark, but it struck me that, knowing as little as I knew about the deep places of the earth, there might be similar things down here, things made strange by lives lived without glimpsing the sun. A chill terror came over me despite the warmth of the water, and I went back to scanning the all but invisible waterline around me, praying I would detect a shore for which I could make a desperate swim. My eyes had continued to adjust to the deepened shadow after being in the comparatively blinding presence of that candle in the prison. More and more fine detail came to me, vague as it was. There were crusts of reflective crystal in the rough, far-off walls here and there, perhaps quartz or some other hazy stone, which caught the stray glows amplified by the water now and then. Subtle as these patterns and reflections were, they looked almost like clouds on a blackened sky, and helped me to trace the outlines of the murky cavern. Spires of stone hung down like spears from the roof in places, and in others it seemed smooth and glassy, and played host much more gracefully to the lights down below. A waterfall, or perhaps more than one, murmured almost unheard against some distant wall as it fed the pool below, and the mist from these unglimpsed impacts shrouded the air in a fine mist. Bats thrummed in small waves overhead, more audible than visible, and snatched bugs from the humid air. Flies or mosquitoes, or something which buzzed like them, skirted past along the surface now and then, and occasionally a splash was heard as a bat swooped low like a seabird and plucked something from the air against the water. Tiny fish about the length of my fingers darted through the lake's higher reaches just beneath me in vast schools, their small bodies occasionally pulsing with a low violet glow, halting now and then to feed on the droppings which the bats loosed from their colonies in the stalactites far above. Darker, larger forms skulked amidst them, almost my size, zipping up to swallow some of their smaller compatriots now and then when they grew too still. All this I drank in over another minute spent dreading the unseen and continuing my lazy kicks to stay afloat, painfully aware of how awkward my swimming must seem to the life which teemed and hunted and hid all around me. But all at once, as a harsh and horizontal outline not terribly far off, I saw a break in one of the low-set clouds of quartz along the wall nearest me, and the more I looked at it, the more I took that flat line against the low glow of the quartz to be unnatural, a structure of some kind, symmetrical and boxy against the jagged and curving shapes of natural and water-worn stone. Had I not been in so dire a situation, the sight of a hand-shaped structure down there in the dark would have frightened me more than it relieved me. But I didn't have the forethought to think that any hand-shaped structure down there in the depths must, by necessity, have been built by the hands of whatever awful cave giants had taken me to begin with. And so, righting myself and securing the bundle of desperately needed supplies, I paddled for that unnatural shape, uncertain of what sort of shoreline it might stand on, but desperate to be back on dry land again. Even if the caves were themselves weird and foreign ground, the lake and its half-seen denizens were even more repulsive. I sided with speed now. I was tentative at first, but figured that the crash of my initial entry into the water had already alerted anything in the area, and that I would be best served by moving quickly, even if that speed was childish and stunted by comparison to the water's native suns. As I moved, I fancied I heard the faint rippling of motion along the surface behind me, but much as I tried to glance back while never slowing my motion, I never saw anything clear, just several outlines hanging back at the edge of my vision, their eyes faintly yellow pinpricks above the disturbed water I left in my wake, following steadily, but never drawing near enough to see clearly. That lack of visual confirmation only served to invigorate me, and, worried that at any moment some unseen hand or unseen jaw would grip my leg, I put every ounce of starved energy I had into my shoreward swim for relative safety. As I drew nearer to that shore, I realized I had indeed glimpsed the roof of some sort of building. It was one among many, seemingly all carven in the stone of the walls and floor, and clustered together on the banks like some strange mirror of a fishing village on the surface. This tiny cluster of buildings projected outward from the wall of the cavern, and the shelf of perfectly flat stone from which it rose was only perhaps 10 or 12 feet thick. The lake's surface was almost perfectly even with this shelf, and beneath that surface, the stone arced away to meet the far wall, leaving the clear waters of the pool shadowed and murky beneath. Several docks of unmarked, smooth stone projected out towards me from the main cluster, and they were low enough for me to tug myself up out of the drink. With salvation in sight, I kicked harder than ever I have in my life. My pursuers, perhaps sensing that I was about to escape them, seemed to close in behind me. I heard the distinct disruption of water as one of them sank under, and I swear to this day I felt the rush of something as it made a lunge through the murk towards me. But I hit the side of the dock and jerked myself up and out of the pool with a ferocity only death can drive one to, and with the bundle sprawled out before me, I scurried on all fours like a rat away from the edge and climbed to my feet once more, careful not to lose my balance on the slickened stone. I turned and caught sight of the trio which had pursued me. They were about the size of big alligators, but soft and vaguely translucent, with broad heads like a salamander, and a swathe of barbels twitching about the needle teeth of their mouths. Their yellowish eyes caught the ambient glow of the chamber as they watched me from below, and their frilled spines pulsed with a faint golden light every few seconds, dazzling in the half-light of the lake chamber. The biggest of them, perhaps the one which had lunged for me, seemed to plod forward in the water, its whole body contorting and its paddle-like tail bringing it up to the edge of the dock upon which I stood. It was trying to follow me up, I realized. I doubted its stumpy legs could carry it well, if at all, over land. And yet, I wasn't about to stay and gamble on that assumption. I bent to scoop up my bundle, prepared to retreat for the buildings and try to find high ground. But when I rose and began my cautious backpedal away from the water's edge, I saw that my pursuers had all near soundlessly turned tail and began their own rapid retreat from the docks. From the darkness beneath the stone shelf that held the docks and the building, a vast black shape, unseen by me till that moment, pursued the salamander things. Dark as midnight against the gleaming flora far below, bloated and round but swift despite its size, and large as a stalwart house back home. I counted my blessings that this half-glimpsed monstrosity seemed to have no legs. The giant pursued the salamander things for only a few short seconds before turning back for the shadows where it dwelt beneath the docks, seemingly oblivious to my presence above. It had only issued forth to run off intruders, I thought. And yet, it must eat well to have attained so awful a size down here in the dark. I stowed these strange speculations away and made for the buildings. The second the threat of water had been put behind me, though, the fear of the pale giants with tapering fingers and iron grasps returned. The harried words ants had offered us in the makeshift prison returned to the forefront of my mind, and I shuddered. What would I do if this was one of their lightless cities, like those ants had mentioned? But there were no traces of growled vocalizations in the shadows amidst all those carven structures, and I saw no flickers of motion save the reflected light upon the quartz cloud up above the buildings. As I pushed out onto the moss-slick streets and gazed into the round apertures that marked what I assumed to be doors or windows, I found no eyes or stirring silhouettes to trouble me, save for a few bats that frightened me half to death flitting from a high balcony as I passed. It seemed more a town than a city, a small outpost, with no more than a dozen constructions. The shapes of them were smooth and yet angled, with the edges having often been worn and chipped with age, giving me the impression that it was old indeed. Veiny, pale latticeworks of what I can only describe as a breed of spongy fungal ivy had devoured the walls, and the chutes and walkways that led up into the structures were as slick and unnavigable to me as the trap chute into the prison had been above. Colonies of large insects or crustaceans of some kind, needle-clawed things not unlike lobsters about as long as my hand, dwelt in the long vacant fungal gardens of the structures, and preyed upon smaller bugs that hugged the shadows. All this led me to believe that the shoreside town was long abandoned, and the cave things which had once erected it were long gone. There was a broad tunnel looming at the edge of town leading into the wall of the cavern, seemingly carved just like the buildings and the roads, a causeway of sorts, large enough for a dozen men upon horses to pass through abreast. But I didn't trouble with that just then. I found an open courtyard near the docks and set up near the center, not too close to any of the looming buildings and not too close to the water's uninviting edge. I hung out Ance's jacket to dry, laid out the damp clothing and candles I'd stowed within it, and took time only to ensure the powder was still secure in its waterproof horn, before eating every ounce of pemmican and jerky I'd been given in a voracious frenzy. I had considered rationing it, but as the meager meal sat there cold before me on the unfurled clothing, and the exhaustion and hunger and desperation of the day pressed down upon me, I didn't think at all. I just ate, as if my body demanded it of me. I don't even remember what it tasted like now. Tough and unforgiving, I'm sure, but it has been so very long since I tasted the provender of the surface world that I longed to have some memory of it, even if it were just jerky and dried morsels. But I do not, and I cannot find solace in such memories. I inhaled the food as a man escaped from drowning inhales air, drank deep from the clear water of the pool along the dock, and then curled up on the unforgiving stone and slept for a long, long time, without heeding the unfamiliarity and unspoken danger of the alien world around me. I awoke several times, always from dreams of home, and my exhaustion must have been great indeed, for I was able to slip effortlessly back into slumber each and every time. I was drunk with sleep and bent with hunger again when I finally awoke for good. Long reliance on sensations rather than stars and skies to tell me the time suggests to me now, in reflection, that I slept for a full day. I rose and drank my fill from the lake, and once dressed in my filthy but nearly dry trousers and jacket, I slipped on Hagen's gifted boots, thanking creation that they were not more than a little large on me. I considered lighting one of the candles to more closely explore the abandoned village, but thought better of spending the light just then, and used only the ambient gleams that haunted the cavern to navigate. It was during this period of cautious exploration that I found an open porch at the rear of one of the buildings, slightly raised from the village shelf, and overhung with a roof of the pale fungal ivy, which twitched and rippled sluggishly like hair in a calm wind whenever anything moved nearby. This rear exit to the structure also hosted a chute I could not investigate, but there were 3 skeletons on the stone ground before that chute, all too large to belong to any average man from the surface. The canines of their skulls were elongated slightly, and the sockets were grotesque and wide. The long-fingered hands looked almost delicate with their flesh stripped from them, and nearby lurked the fallen weapons I imagined they had held in their final moments, knives of obsidian and clubs of heavy, solid stone. One of the skulls was hoven in, and another of the corpses had had the bones of its forearms snapped. The moist air of the lake chamber had seen to it that no trace of clothing or soft tissue remained, all having long ago fallen to sludge and dust. or the predations of the insects that scuttled the floor. I understood none of the implications of this then, but merely considered it a stroke of luck. I took the 2 largest femurs as makeshift clubs and stowed one of the broad knives near my sleeping space, planning to try and find something to wrap it with for a handle. The stone clubs I left, for I could lift them, but only with effort, and I imagined I would struggle to swing one ably, even if I were better fed and rested. Armed, I felt a little more secure. Crude as the armaments were, the long hours had given me no comfort here in my new environment, and amidst all that uncertain darkness, I yearned for the small consolation that I was still capable of violent defense. I lingered in the town for perhaps 5 days after that. I tried lurking by the water along the docks to snatch fish by hand, but was unsuccessful, and, moreover, feared that I would eventually draw attention from below. So as hunger bit deep, I eventually settled on the colonies of crawling things in the abandoned gardens. They were, as I've said, vaguely lobster-like, though they were far thinner, frilled and spined along the back carapace, and boasted many more legs. I clubbed them with the femurs, and broke them open like shellfish, eating their tails raw. They had the earthen taste of dirt about them, but I did not fall ill eating them, and was able to gorge myself, uncertain of how frequently such easy food would be available to me when I eventually left. Leaving was becoming more and more necessary. I had been untroubled the first couple days, but I had begun hearing stirrings and rustlings in the larger buildings when I'd awaken from sleep, and had twice glimpsed the long, slender legs of some great crawling thing retracting into the chutes along the sides of the dwellings as I strode into view. Though I had not seen this shy giant insect in the open, and had no reason to assume it had taken an interest in me, I didn't want to sit still in the courtyard I occupied long enough to find out firsthand whether it was a predator. But leaving was a challenge all its own. The causeway tunnel which led into the cavern wall and out of town was yawning and black, and the low ambient light of the cavern I dwelt in did not reach more than a few dozen yards in before it gave way to total darkness. This demanded I light and spend one of my precious candles for the purpose of navigating, and so, before departure, I needed to ensure I would have a way to make light and keep fire along my trip, whatever my destination. I had spotted strange black-domed mushrooms that the lobster things ignored in their derelict garden burrows, and along with this avoidance, their dry, dusty texture and their foul odor of rot told me they were likely poisonous. Poisonous or not, they caught fire like decade-dead kindling from the dried flint and broken knife I'd been given, and the bowl shape of the mushroom's cap allowed one to hold it in hand as the embers smoldered amidst its dry gills. I burned several small fires with them, using the pale fungal ivy as smoky fuel, in the courtyard during my last day there, a proof of concept, in the hopes I could replicate the blaze elsewhere in this titanic hell I'd found myself in. I cooked some of the lobster things, and though this did nothing to help their flavor, it made them decidedly less chewy. I burned several to crust them over as road rations after waking on my final day in the ruined village, and wrapped them in the jacket like a bag, along with many of the dry black mushroom caps and my other supplies. I thought about trying to transition the powder out of the horn and use that as a water vessel, but given all I'd seen of the caverns thus far, water was never far away, and was usually relatively clear. I drank deep, though, just in case. I gathered my courage, lit a candle with the embers of one of my fires, and scooped some of those embers into one of the dry mushroom caps I'd collected, in hopes I'd be able to use them to re-establish a fire down the way. Then, I stepped out of the misty damp of the lake chamber, and into the gloom of the causeway, hoping, in vain, that it would whisk me away to some place less terrible.